Good evening everybody, and welcome to the talk this evening, Searching for Life as We Don't Know It. My name is Laura Hepburn and I am a marine biogeochemist. Basically, this means that I still can't quite decide whether I prefer science or geography, so fortunately for me, I've managed to find a career that combines the two. I became a biogeochemist because I'm fascinated by the way that life not only exists, but can thrive in some of the most remote and seemingly inhospitable places on Earth. And this is a research interest that has taken me from 1.5 miles beneath the surface of the Southern Ocean to the surface of Mars. Unfortunately, in the latter case, not directly, yet, anyway. The focus of my talk tonight will be some of the stunning footage that we've collected from the depths of the Southern Ocean at some very unique ecosystems called hydrothermal vents. In Latin, hydro means water and thermal means heat. So, simply put, hydrothermal vents are geologic features of the seabed that release hot water from the Earth's crust into the deep ocean. And with that as a bit of a hook for what's to come, I actually want to begin my talk this evening with a plea for your help to inspire and support a project that the RSGS and I will be working on throughout 2022. I've been working as an academic researcher and educator now for over a decade, and in that time I have watched UK geoscience reach a crisis point. In 2019, there were 43% fewer students studying geology and geography at undergraduate level at university than there were in 2014. This is a simply staggering decline over an incredibly short time period. And one of the most concerning things is that at the moment we're still not quite sure why. What's worse is that we have never needed geographers, geologists, oceanographers, hydrographers, geoengineers more than we do right now. We are part of an ever-expanding global population that demands ever-increasing living standards. And as such, we need skilled geoscientists who understand the way that our Earth, our ocean, and our atmosphere interact with one another, and in particular, the effects that we as humans are having on this interaction. We need these geoscientists to be able to secure clean and affordable water, energy and sanitation for future generations. We need to responsibly source and consume raw materials such as the metals and the rare earth elements that are so essential for building the green technologies that will help us to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. And we need to better understand and to strengthen the resilience of our Earth and ocean against climate change and an increasing frequency of natural hazards. And we especially need people with these particular skills if we're going to attempt to do all of this at the same time as minimising our impact on the environment. As geoscientists, it is abundantly clear that we have an overwhelming amount of work still to do. But in the next 10 to 15 years, the UK geo industry is facing a bottleneck in the recruitment process, and it will lack the people with the essential geo-based skills that are going to be needed to meet the United Nations sustainability goals by 2030. And this is where you come in. This year, we will be releasing a very short questionnaire and asking for volunteers to participate in some interviews. We want to know your views and your perceptions of geography and geology and other geosciences as subjects. And another thing that we're particularly interested in is finding out what concerns you may have, or for yourselves or for your children or your grandchildren, about taking up a career in geoscience. Your opinions are absolutely crucial for helping us to understand why students are no longer interested or are actively being discouraged from studying the geosciences at school, and particularly later on in the higher education. And with that, I want to share with you some of the really cool work that I get to do as a geoscientist, and to also introduce you to some of the fantastic technology that makes it all possible. Between 2009 and 2015, I was involved in a series of expeditions to the Scotia Sea in the Southern Ocean to search for hydrothermal vents. I still really vividly remember the first time that I saw a vent during one of the first of these expeditions, as it was being recorded by our deep sea submersible and live streamed to the lab that I was working in. We had been sat in the lab working away on our computers and processing some samples, and we'd been there for a couple of hours watching the deep sea submersible descend through the water column and then eventually reach the seabed and traverse along it in the search for these hydrothermal vents. And we hadn't really seen very much. It had been quite dull for about quite a long time now. And then suddenly the screen just went black, and the cameras on our deep sea submersible were completely engulfed by these billowing plumes of black smoke. And in the lab, we could tell that the pilots of the submersible were getting really excited as well, because the cameras started to pan around and try to work out what was going on and where this stuff was coming from. And then, very slowly, the submersible turned around, and there was just the most fantastic sight before us. It was quite a bare hydrothermal vent. It wasn't covered in the massive abundance of life that we found at some of the other sites later on, but just perched at the top of this hydrothermal vent, holding onto it for dear life like a mountain climber on the side of a rock face, was one solitary crab, and it popped its claw towards the hydrothermal fluid and then drew it back as if it was saying, oh, that's a bit too hot. And this image has so vividly stuck with me, because it just exemplifies how, yes, fragile life can be, but at the same time, it has a surprising resilience as well, and we can find life in the most unsuspecting of places. Now, the Scotia area that we are working in was actually named after the Scotia steam yacht that made the first bathymetric study of the region during the Scottish National Antarctic Expedition between 1902 and 1904. Now, over 100 years after this original intrepid oceanic voyage, we returned to the similar area to explore the volcanically active East Scotia Ridge, which runs along the seafloor entirely hidden from view. And this ridge forms the eastern component of the Scotia tectonic plate. The top of the Scotia tectonic plate joins the tip of Chile in South America. It then runs along for about 1900 miles before curving down to the south for another 500 miles and then curving westwards back on itself, finally joining the tip of Chile with the northernmost tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Now, as a geographically aware audience, I'm sure that you're very familiar with the concept of plate tectonics, the fact that the Earth's crust isn't made of one continuous unit. It's divided into smaller pieces that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle, and that all of these pieces, these tectonic plates, move relative to one another, either pulling apart to form deep trenches, crashing together to form mountains, or sliding or sinking past one another. Well, the Scotia Sea is a very tectonically active area, and it's made more so because our larger tectonic plates that are present here are divided into even smaller microplates, and all of these smaller microplates are moving relative to the larger plates as well. Importantly, hydrothermal vents are found throughout the global ocean, but they're generally mostly found clustered together along the global mid-ocean ridge system. The mid-ocean ridge system marks all of the boundaries in our tectonic plates. It stretches for more than 40,000 miles and connects one long continuous range of underwater volcanoes all the way around the globe. Now, along these tectonic boundaries, where the crust is being broken apart and fractured by the movement of the plates, we get deep fissures forming in the rock. Seawater from the deep ocean starts to trickle down through these cracks and into the Earth's crust. As this seawater continues to move downwards, it gets closer to heat sources such as magma chambers and hotspots, which start to warm it up. Now at this point, our seawater is heated to temperatures of up to 400 degrees Celsius. For comparison, the water in your kitchen kettle boils at 100 degrees Celsius, and 400 degrees Celsius is the temperature at which mild steel begins to glow a bright red when it's heated. Now, at these kind of temperatures and pressures deep within the Earth, this seawater undergoes a series of chemical reactions that change it from seawater into hydrothermal fluid. There are two really important chemical reactions that occur at this stage. The first of these is the removal of oxygen from the seawater and the acidification of the water as well. As our hot, acidic water now continues to travel through the crust, it starts to dissolve the surrounding rocks. And as it does so, the metals and other components from the rock become entrained into the hydrothermal fluid. At this stage, our hydrothermal fluid is absolutely chock full of metals like iron and copper, lead and zinc, and sometimes even gold as well. It also contains other dissolved compounds that it picks up from the rocks, like dissolved hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and methane. Now, hot liquids are less dense and more buoyant than cold liquids. You can have a go at observing and recreating the release of hydrothermal fluid into the deep sea at home by carefully placing a small vessel of hot water with some food colouring in it into a larger vessel of cold water. Look closely and see what happens. These hot hydrothermal fluids rise up through the crust just as a hot air balloon rises in the air. As it does so, the hydrothermal fluid carries all of the dissolved metals and the hydrogen sulfide along with it. The hydrothermal fluids exit the chimney and mix with the cold seawater. The rapid temperature difference between the hot fluid and the cold seawater causes the metals within the hydrothermal fluid to rapidly precipitate out and to form solid clumps of metal sulfides as the metals combine with the sulfide in the fluid. Now, it's the precipitation of these tiny, tiny, tiny little black particles of metal sulfides that make the hydrothermal vents look like they're smoking, and it's also what gives them their nickname as black smokers. Black smokers are the hottest type of hydrothermal vent that we find in the deep sea, and they release fluids at temperatures of about 350 to 375 degrees Celsius. But there are other types of hydrothermal vents as well. The second hottest vent is a white smoker. Here, the hydrothermal fluids mix with the seawater underneath the seafloor. So the black metals instead form underground and they're deposited beneath the seafloor before the fluid exits the chimney. The white appearance of the hydrothermal fluid from this type of vent is mainly due to the presence of a mineral called anhydrite. Anhydrite is a white calcium sulfate mineral that forms at a slightly lower temperature than the metal sulfides. But not all of the hydrothermal fluids flow out of chimneys. In some places, we can see them seeping directly out of the ocean floor. Now here, the high temperature fluids mix well below the seabed, and all of the minerals are deposited under the seafloor instead. The diffuse flow fluids are usually much clearer and much cooler, and they flow a lot more slowly than the hydrothermal fluid that vents from black and white smokers. Now, As you've been watching from the footage as I've been talking, you can see that we found all different types of these hydrothermal vents along the East Scotia Ridge, so it's quite a volcanically diverse area as well. But how on earth did we find these systems? How do we go about finding for something that we can't see, that lies miles beneath the surface of the ocean? Well, the telltale sign of a hydrothermal vent is actually the fluid that it emits. Our first step to locating a hydrothermal vent is to find the hydrothermal plume. And we do this using a very standard piece of oceanographic equipment called a CTD. A CTD is essentially a large stainless steel frame that contains an inner core of electronic equipment, including all of the sensors that we use to survey the ocean. The main sensors in this array continuously record the conductivity, the temperature, and the depth of the ambient water. And it's these three main properties that give the CTD its name. But the CTD is often also equipped with additional sensors, things like transmissometers that help us to measure light levels, and acoustic Doppler current profiles that help us to measure the speed and direction of the prevailing current. And nowadays we are starting to develop much more accurate sensors that allow us to detect some of the chemical components of the water column, like dissolved oxygen and pH levels, so we can detect these too. Surrounding this electronic core is a ring of large heavy-duty plastic bottles called Niskin bottles. And these are used to also take some water samples. When we deploy the CTD, the bottles are left open, and when the sensors during a dive start to show us that we've reached an interesting area of the water column in terms of its physics or its chemistry, we can then fire a signal down from the surface to the top of the ship to the CTD under the water, which snaps shut the lids on the top and the bottom of the Niskin bottle and contains the water for analysis later on in the lab. Now, in order to find the plume, we tow the CTD along the side or the back of the ship in a process that we call mowing the lawn. We steer the ship along a straight course. We then rotate it by 180 degrees and come back on ourselves. And we do this over and over and over again until we've completed our full transect of the area of interest. Now, as well as towing the CTD through the water, we can also raise it up and down in the water column, and this gives us a kind of 3D picture of what's going on within the water. The signals that we're looking for in our hydrothermal vent plume are very slightly elevated temperatures and some chemical components as well, like helium, to see where these things are most concentrated. Now, once we've slightly narrowed down the survey area with the CTD, we then use an echo sounder to map the seabed and to create a digital image of the seafloor topography. Now, rather than being attached to the bottom of the ship, the echo sounder is instead mounted to our deep sea robot, which is in turn attached to the ship. But this means that we can get a lot closer to the seabed and survey it at a much higher resolution. Now, at this point, we're working at about 20 metres above the seafloor. And this enables us to pick out some of the very detailed seafloor features. In particular, in terms of hydrothermal vents, we're looking for any spikes in the seabed that might indicate the presence of a chimney sticking up out of the seafloor. Once we've identified this potential survey area down to a few square kilometres or so, over a series of dives, we will then make use of our full remotely operated vehicle, or ROV. And for British expeditions, this will most likely be the ROV Isis, who's named after the Egyptian sun god. The Isis ROV is an incredibly capable piece of kit. Weighing in at 4,000 kilos in air, she can operate at depths of up to 4 miles under the ocean. So our Southern Ocean settings at 1.5 miles deep didn't give her any problems at all. However, This series of expeditions was the first time that she had ever visited a hydrothermal vent, and there was one important modification that had to be made before she was ready. When we were talking to the engineers about the hydrothermal systems, they were a bit worried that her manipulator arms that she uses to do sampling and to investigate and pick up samples would be held in the 400°C hydrothermal fluid for up to about 20 minutes at a time while we were collecting samples. The manipulator arms were originally made of stainless steel, so these had to be made instead out of titanium so that they could withstand the higher temperatures. The hydrothermal vents that we were working on could have easily converted our £4.5 million robot into a piece of molten metal in no time whatsoever. In addition to these articulated manipulator arms that allow the small-scale sampling and the use of our fiddly scientific equipment, ISIS is also kitted out with 2 high-resolution cameras. One is fixed and the other can pan and tilt. She's got a few other cameras as well. These are at standard resolution, standard definition, and they're at the back and the bottom. And like the screens nowadays in our cars that help us to park, this helps the pilots to perform small-scale manoeuvres while she's in the water. But despite some fairly fancy electronic equipment, bizarrely, one of the most expensive pieces of kit on ISIS is the red and yellow foam that you can see at the top. And this is a compressed foam that enables her to maintain a neutral buoyancy in the water column for when we're carrying out delicate sampling processes. ISIS isn't simply towed along by the ship. She has her own thrusters and she can move in all directions through the water column, including up and down. And during every dive, there is a dedicated team of 2 to 3 pilots that control the ROV every single second that she's in the water. And this is all done from a control van on the deck of the ship. The control van, when we're working, is in essence a shipping container that we keep in complete darkness. And inside we're surrounded by about 30 TV screens, and these are all recording information from the sensors aboard ISIS, but also all of the video imaging that is being collected at the time. From the control vans, the pilots can also move the manipulator arms using specialised articulated controls that look like a highly advanced PlayStation console. And finally, the entire ROV itself is mounted on top of a sampling tray that can be slid open and shut during the course of the dive. In this tray, we store all of the equipment that we need during the dive. And this equipment is always specifically tailored for the type of dive that we're carrying out, depending on whether we're wanting to collect biological, chemical, geological, or physical data and/or samples. Now, the first thing to do when we reach a hydrothermal system with the ROV is to document everything that we see. This involves hour upon hour of meticulously videoing and photographing the vent system over and over again. And this allows us to make up a really detailed photomosaics of the vent sites. The final images that you're seeing now were compiled back on land by one of my marine biology colleagues, Dr. Lee Marsh. Although these images look like simple point-and-shoot photos of the vent sites, they're actually compiled from thousands of still images captured from the video that have been carefully stitched together at an incredibly high resolution. And this allows the biologists to painstakingly map out the complex ecology of the vent site. Certain animals, such as the stalked barnacles and the crabs that you see in these images, tend to cluster in communities at the top of the vent sites. This is where the water is much, much warmer. However, other animals cluster instead in communities at the bottom of the vent sites, and this is because it's warm here, but not too hot. Now, once we're sure we've collected all of the video that we need, then, and only then, do we move on to collecting any kind of physical sample from the site. Now, I'm going to take a brief pause here and I'll allow you to enjoy some amazing footage that shows the ISIS ROV in sampling mode. Among the most important outcomes of our expedition was the discovery that the hydrothermal systems of the Southern Ocean represented an entirely new biogeographic province. A biogeographic province is a region that is defined by the distribution of the dominant animals that we find living there. Hydrothermal vent communities in different parts of the global ocean are dominated by different types of animals. Wherever it's not possible for the larvae of one vent to travel to another vent site, we establish a completely new biogeographic province. And so far, we have found 11 separate regions of these along the mid-oceanic ridge. Some of these are dominated by giant tube worms or hairy snails. Others are dominated by blind shrimp or massive clams that live on hydrogen, or in the case of the Southern Ocean system, hairy-chested crabs that grow bacteria that use the chemical energy coming out of the hydrothermal vents to supplement their food source. What's unique about the Southern Ocean systems is that they have been geographically isolated from all of the other vent settings for the last 30 million years by the circumpolar current that continuously rotates a vast body of water around the Antarctic continent. And the fact that we don't find any of the animals that are commonly found in the vent systems of the Pacific, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean in the Southern Ocean suggests that this circumpolar current acts as a physical barrier to the distribution of these animals, and that these systems in the Southern Ocean evolved entirely independently from those found everywhere else on Earth, with their own unique ecology. I really hope you've enjoyed the talk this evening. I hope you've gotten a little bit of a taster into the study of hydrothermal vent systems. I'm really looking forward to speaking to a couple of you and to having the opportunity to answer as many questions as I possibly can. And with that, I'm going to leave you with a very final short piece of footage that highlights some of the important reasons for studying hydrothermal vents in the deep sea.